And thank you for joining us today. As the title of this webinar suggests, we will be diving into the world of lateral hiring. We are going to talk about why lateral hiring has become more important to law firms over the past several years. We will also talk about success and, by extension, failure rates within the lateral hiring world. We're going to try to define what terms like success and failure mean, or at least kind of look at it from a various different lenses. And perhaps most importantly, I think we're going to try to talk about how firms are trying to improve their hiring programs and the things we heard from firms as we talked to them about their hiring programs. Before we do all of that, I want to cover some logistics and introduce our speakers. On the logistics, the webinar is being recorded. Everything is on the record. You're welcome to share things on social media. I think the slides will be shared later today or perhaps tomorrow via an email. We do plan to take questions in your webinar system. You can submit questions. When it makes sense, we'll do our best to answer those questions as they come in. If a question touches on something we're going to talk about later, we might park the question for a few minutes, but I promise we will do our very best to answer any and all questions. Worst come to worst, you can always email myself or Howard or Michael, and we will do our best to answer it then. With that out of the way, let me introduce our speakers. The first speaker is me. My name is Nicholas Brew. I am a director of the ALM Intelligence Fellows Program, and also I am ALM Senior Analyst for the legal industry. My job at ALM is to dive into the data on the legal industry and also gather information through conversations with industry leaders. The goal of all that digging and that interviewing is ultimately to distill what we find into market intelligence for all of you to consume. In the particular case of this research, ALM partnered with another organization. That organization, as you guys may have already guessed, is Decipher. And that is why Michael and Howard are joining us today. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself and perhaps say something about Decipher?
Sure. My name is Michael Ellenhorn. I'm the co-founder and general counsel of Decipher. I am a U.S. lawyer and an English solicitor. Decipher is a competitive intelligence firm serving the legal services industry, which primarily focuses on competitive intelligence in the area of pre-hire due diligence. We perform deep dive due diligence on law firms, AmLaw 200 firms, lateral partner hires. And we help firms better utilize their data and their intelligence to make better decisions on not only talent, but on other areas of their business. And I'm joined by Howard Rosenberg.
Hello, I'm Howard Rosenberg. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Decipher, and I am a recovering COO, as I've worked with firms such as Bryan Cave, Leighton Paisner in London, Baker McKenzie in Washington, D.C., and Deborah Boyce in New York City.
With introductions out of the way, the information Michael and Howard and I are going to discuss today is really the culmination of more than 3 months of research on lateral hiring. For Michael and Howard, it's the culmination of years of focus on this area. We will go into the research methodology. We're going to talk about the findings of that research. But before we do that, I want to set the stage a little and talk about why we chose to focus our research on this area. You know, at its heart, the lateral hiring is about people, right? That in any given year, what we see is about 2,000 to 3,000 lateral partner moves between AmLaw 200 firms. That's what we're looking at here on this line graph. In 2010, we saw about 2,000 partners move from one AmLaw firm to another. We saw a slight uptick, as the graph shows, in the years after 2010, and things have been pretty stable since then, right? Last year, we saw about 2,700 moves. To law firm leaders, there's also sort of another component to consider, and that's the dollars. The average lateral partner moves with roughly $2 million in books of business. That figure, as the graph shows at the bottom of the screen, has grown slowly over the past decade, but it has grown. if you do the math on all these numbers, they add up really quick, right? 2,700 lateral partners with an average of $2 million of books of business. That means in any given year, we see about $3 billion in books of business moving through the lateral market. In a slow-growing market, these dollars are a big deal, right? 31 billion since 2010, that's a lot of dollars. It's the reason why managing partners have consistently told us over the last decade, right, since the downturn, which has been a very slow growth period for the legal market, that lateral hiring is moving up their list of priorities. In fact, most law firms, if you ask them what their top growth priorities are, they will tell you lateral hiring is at the very top. That's ultimately one of the reasons why we chose to dive into this area. The other reason we looked at lateral hiring is that it impacts so many firms. There is a belief out in the marketplace, and I have heard this story many times, that there's a couple firms driving all the lateral hiring activity. As someone who studies data, as someone who analyzes data, I will tell you that the data, which obviously this graph shows, it simply just doesn't support this idea. What we're looking at here is the percentage of AmLaw 200 firms by the number of hires they do in any given year. And what we're looking at is the average of the hires over the period of 2014 to 2018. As you can see on the first line, 3% of firms average 0 hires, right? So that's the firms that don't do any hiring. The corollary of that, obviously, is that 97% of firms did at least 1 hire per year over the last 5 years. Of course, most of them did more than 1 hire, and that's what the graph shows. Over half of firms do between 6 and 50 hires per year. Put simply, 54% of the AmLaw firms average at least 1 hire every 2 months. And you know, what's important to note here is that these what makes this important is that these hires take a lot of energy, they take a lot of dollars. I think, Howard, I think you were going to talk a little about that.
Yeah, so this slide is slightly deceptive because while the numbers indicate that the average AmLaw 200 firm is indeed hiring a lateral partner once every 2 months, just stand back and think about how many dollars that actually equates to. So if one assumes that the cost of acquiring a lateral partner all in terms of comp and recruiters' fees and other internal onboarding fees is roughly about $2.5 million, and we times this by the 6, this equates to an average cost per firm of around $15 million a year. This is just the average. At firms who hire towards the top end of the volume aspect, this could be as high as $60 million a year. It's a huge number.
That's real money.
Yeah. It is real money. It's one thing that I think, Michael, you mentioned to me, an interesting way to think about this is for the firms who are doing, 26 to 50 hires, or maybe even 12 to 25, this is almost like an acquisition or like a merger every year they're doing, but they're doing it, of course, piecemeal, like it's a retail merger instead of a wholesale merger. That really changed the way I looked at this, I have to say. I thought that was a really interesting way to look at it.
It's also, if you think about all the energy and the myriad of people hours that's involved in the initial interview process, the flying in of partners to meet their colleagues, the writing up of notes, the debriefing time, let alone the onboarding time, it's really kind of a minor miracle that any firm hires at all. It's definitely not for the faint-hearted, this issue of lateral hiring.
Yeah, and I think it cuts to sort of the third reason we looked at it, which is what I already alluded to earlier, which is sort of those success and failure rates. I think the first thing to note here is that success and failure, it's a difficult topic in the lateral world. I've talked to law firms about how they define success and failure. Every firm thinks about it differently. I think also, sometimes even with different hires, there's different metrics that we're looking at. I think one thing we looked at first, and I don't think this is the silver bullet, but it's one way to at least begin attacking this, is retention rates. And that's what's on the graph we're looking at here. Before I get into the data on the graph, I want to talk about sort of the data we looked at to derive these numbers. There are a lot of different ways to look at retention rates. There are also different firms you can look at. This is the AmLaw 200. What we did is we logged into ALM's Legal Compass tool. We analyzed the 10,000 partner moves that happened over the past 5 years. We looked at what percentage of partners who moved a year ago were at the hiring firm a year later, what percentage of partners that moved 2 years ago were at that firm still, and so forth and so forth. What we see here is that 95% of partners are still at the hiring firm in year one, right? Pretty high retention rates 1 year later. 90% are in year two, and then there's a pretty big drop off between year two and year three. In my mind, what this shows is that most firms are giving their partners a 2-year grace period or something similar to a 2-year grace period. That, of course, as we see sort of from 3 years, we drop down pretty quickly, right? We go to 60% by year 5. And of course, that means that 40% of partners have left by that time. Given the time and dollars involved that Howard just mentioned, a 5-year retention rate feels fairly close to a failure to me, given all the time and energy that's put in. And I think, as I mentioned, the retention rates are really just the tip of the iceberg.
No, that's very true. That's very true. And what you're seeing, of course, in those numbers, Nick, is that true? You've got at 5 years 60% retention rate. And by the way, there are other studies. Hugh Simon certainly did one not too long ago, where you had a retention rate and a failure rate that were roughly even, that departure rate. So it was really a 50-50 proposition. But just going with our with our survey numbers, realizing that it takes a long time for a lateral partner to become accretive. They've got to move in, and they have to transition their clients, and hopefully they will transition their clients. And then they've got to get their team set up, and hopefully they have active files and matters to work on. The bills have to go out. It just takes a long time for a lateral partner to become truly accretive. And as Howard mentioned before, the cost of that entire process, it's not just the recruiting, it's the onboarding and everything else. You are looking at way, way more money than simply the direct cost of their compensation as a partner. The other part of this that I think people have to realize is that there are also plenty of partners that effectively fail in place. And when you think about it, it's not just retention. It's not just whether you recruit a lateral partner and they come to the firm and they stay, or they stay for longer than 5 years. You also have, and this just comes out of our data, you also have about 62% of laterals that don't bring even close to what they promised in terms of portable business. Plus, you have another, and this is survey data. I mean, you have another sort of 35% of lateral partners who may just not fit culturally with the firm. Doesn't mean they're bad people. They just may not be, honestly, on the right platform. So when you look at a Venn diagram, luckily there's only 3 elements to this. If you look at a Venn diagram and you think 40 to 50% failure rate in terms of retention, you think 62% of lateral partners aren't getting close to bringing their full books of business as promised, and then you get another sort of 35% who are there but honestly are maybe on the wrong platform, you can see that you've got a failure rate in lateral partner overall in lateral hiring. You've got a failure rate that's way north of 50%. And given the cost, it's just something I think people have to think about.
Yeah, I think if you step back from these past 3 slides, I think you can see why we chose to spend the last several months looking at this area, right? Lateral hiring, I think on the one hand, represents this huge opportunity for firms. It's an opportunity to acquire talented people. It's an opportunity to acquire dollars, of course. But then there's this huge challenge, right? It's the huge challenge of the retention rates, of onboarding, of making an individual successful, of choosing the right individual. And that's really what drove us to this. And before we get into the findings, I want to talk a little about the research methodology. I don't want to talk about this to bore you all with how we collected data, but I want to give you guys a sense of the data you will see, where it comes from, And hopefully that provides some credibility to the data. We took sort of three different approaches to gathering information. One is what I already mentioned, data analysis. We looked inside ALM's Legal Compass tool. We looked at the over 10,000 lateral moves that exist in there, and we studied them. We combined them with other data sets to try to understand what that data can tell us, and it told us a lot. The second was a custom survey. ALM and Decipher issued a custom survey to AmLaw 200 firms. We asked a whole range of questions. Many of them you will see inside this webinar, but also others you'll see in the report that we issued that go into specific topics on lateral hiring, where we had really point questions we wanted to get information from firms. About a quarter of the AmLaw 200 responded. The responses came from really a broad section of the AmLaw 200. We have global firms, we have regional firms, we have larger firms and smaller firms. We have firms that do no lateral hiring and firms that do a ton of lateral hiring. It's pretty reflective of the AmLaw 200 in general. The last one was interviews. I'm a big believer in interviews. I think it's really important to add context to data to understand the actual experience on the ground, and that's why we spent a lot of time on the phone. We ended up speaking to over 40 AmLaw 200 firms. Those were typically heads of talent, heads of recruitment, or managing partners. Interviews were typically about an hour long. We talked about a broad range of issues related to lateral hiring. And we also talked to sort of other thought leaders who touch the lateral hiring world, recruiters, consultants, and people like that. We didn't just look at one part of the lateral hiring world. We really tried to look at the entire thing, from the needs assessment, where people are and firms are sitting down and thinking about where they're going to be hiring, where they want to put their effort, candidate sourcing, how they're working with recruiters, due diligence, of course, and interviewing, structuring the offer, and also obviously on the integration piece, which Michael mentioned is a big deal. I would break our findings down into sort of two groups. The first is sort of looking at the first half of the lateral hiring part. This is what I'd call the needs assessment portion and the candidate sourcing. This is how we find the right people who we want to be targeting, how we find candidates who we're considering. I think the common difficulties we found both in the data and also in the interviews were, I think firms struggled to manage opportunistic versus strategic hires. We will talk about that in a second. They struggled with finding recruiters who they can be a quote unquote partner with. This was a common conversation that came up in almost every single conversation with firms. And then there was a real difficulty to understand the risks related to different types of hires. To sort of flesh all that out, I want to look at why law firms hire laterals. And I think you can start to see something that's really obvious here. If you look at this graph, what we see is these are AmLaw 200 firms, and this is explaining why they are going out into the lateral markets to hire people. 74% of firms told us they go and hire laterals because they want to gain new relationships. Well, that sounds awfully similar to sort of another data point, which is to seize new revenue. These two aren't exactly the same, but I think it cuts to a common thread here, is that they are looking to develop relationships. They are looking to develop new business lines, find new revenue sources. And if you combine those, right, it's 85% of firms told us that this was a real priority for them. This is one of the reasons. 50% tell us they're strengthening existing practice areas. 46% tell us they use it to expand into new areas. I'll tell you, in conversations with firms, this was a very big topic. And 12% tell us they replace existing partners. I think for me, this bit about growth is a really big piece, and it's something that came up so many times in conversations. What I consistently heard firms struggling with is sort of the opportunistic versus strategic hire. And what firms are telling us in this data is that part of the reason they're hiring laterals is because they want to grow. And that ultimately means when they find someone who maybe doesn't fit some of their strategic goals, they still want to consider them, because ultimately growth is one of the primary reasons they're going into the lateral world. I can tell you, I heard a similar story from many firms that sort of I think bridges the needs assessment and candidate sourcing portion of the lateral hiring life cycle. They would tell me that in November and December, they would sit down, they would make a plan, they would identify the candidates. There was different levels of sophistication in how firms would identify the candidates they want to sort of strategically go find. Some firms created profiles of individuals. They said how old the individual should be, what market they should be based in, the kinds of relationships they had. Some firms were very detailed. Others were a little more loosey-goosey. But then what happens is in December, they finalize their plans, and in January, the resumes start just flooding in from recruiters. And that's where the challenge really was in terms of, do I go after this opportunistic hire or do I stay with my strategic plan? And that was a consistent problem I've heard over and over again, not just in this research study, but even in prior ones. I think this is a really big problem for many firms, and it's something that I think there are some interesting solutions. I know Howard has talked to a few firms that are using a what I think is a really neat approach to solve this problem.
Yeah, and as Nick was saying on kind of the opportunistic versus the strategic, is that we see a number of firms addressing this issue by adopting what we call a triage approach. This is to say that they've actually designed and operate a two-tier style structure. So where lateral recruitment is of real strategic importance, they've created a wholly separate team that reports directly into, say, the managing partner or the chair of the firm. They operate like a specialized SWAT team, usually working under very compressed deadlines. And this frees them up from the normal bureaucracy that's often associated with the more routine but vital to get right every day type of lateral candidate opportunity. Many firms have, I think, realized that they are indeed in the talent business, and I do stress the word business, as they need to really compete in a global market. And I think Michael and I see many more firms adopting this kind of two-tier structure going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I love this structure. I've talked to a few firms who use it as well. I think it's a neat structure because I think it also allows you to have slightly different processes. I've heard some firms tell me that they have a much more rigorous due diligence process for opportunistic hires, in part because the business case hasn't been vetted, right? For a strategic hire, the firm sat down, often over a several-month period, and really thought about who this individual might be. I think it's really interesting to say, if someone falls in our lap, we're going to be very skeptical from the onset, and we have to do more digging. I think that's a really enlightened approach. I'm curious, Michael, you obviously used to be a recruiter. I'm curious to hear you talk about sort of the recruiter law firm relationship that kind of sits at the heart of this sort of opportunistic strategic piece.
Sure. I mean, it is, it really is a question of, it really comes down to, I guess, whether law firms want to rely on their own generated intelligence, their own generated data, their own focus, their own strategic focus in terms of what it is that they're trying to achieve with their growth objectives, whether they want to focus on those things and really be on the front foot, really control that process, whether they want to be in that where they've got a firm hand on the tiller, so to speak, and they really are steering the ship, or whether they're more relaxed and more willing to allow contingent recruiters to control that space a little bit more. And I will tell you that it can be, and this goes, Nick and Howard, this goes to your point about opportunistic hires. It can be fairly comfortable to rely on the candidates that are introduced on a contingent basis by recruiters. And we used to call that, recruiter-induced myopia. It can be very comfortable if they are high-quality candidates, if you have a good relationship with the recruiter. They really can be very effective from the recruiter standpoint at kind of flooding the zone and making sure that you're looking at their candidates and you're looking at a lot of them, if they're good and they're dialed in. Unfortunately, what that can do, although it serves the recruiter very well, what it can do though is it can derail the firm's strategy in terms of them, again, having a firm hand on things and sort of being on the front foot. What we have seen works better in a more, what I would consider from an intelligence standpoint, a more balanced approach, is the firms being very focused in terms of what the strategic underlying plan is for their growth objectives, and actually doing more of the intelligence work on the front end so that the firm is in a position where they can go to their favorite recruiters who offer a very important and valuable service. They can go to their preferred recruiters and they can say, here are the 5 or 6 people that we want you to approach. And this is what we want you to say to them. And this is how we would like them effectively delivered to us. And we will take things from there. Because firms tend to be able to follow through in a more complete, holistic way when they are starting from a position of strength in terms of that data and intelligence that they own. When they really understand the space that they're moving into, and they understand it so well that they're effectively handpicking those individuals. Now, Nick, you might ask, well, that's fine, but recruiters will bring them actual warm bodies that may very well be already in the market and ripe for a move. And of course, even in a strategic situation where these are people that actually do fit into your plan, the question that firms then have to ask, again, this circles back to that question of whose data, whose intelligence. Even in those circumstances, you have to ask yourself, okay, why are they on the market? And once again, you come back to that point that opportunistic hires tend to have a higher failure rate. And so you need to really look very hard. You have to look in a very hard, very focused way at what data, what intelligence do I need to make sure that the people that I'm bringing on are going to be a good fit.
Yeah, Howard touched on something that I think is a really interesting point, is that, and this is something we did hear from law firms, which is that opportunistic hires do typically have sort of a lower hit rate. And I think it highlights something that's really interesting when you look at sort of these different reasons for hiring. All of these have slightly different risk profiles. And this is something we looked at. If you look at sort of the different reasons a firm may hire, to grow the business actually has a pretty high risk profile. What we've seen both on the data side and also anecdotally from firms is they tell us when they're hiring people who perhaps were not strategically defined, that fit previously defined strategic goals, what they tend to find is their retention rates, their success rates are lower. What's interesting is when firms are hiring to sort of expand into existing strengths, they tend to tell us that their success rates are higher. And this makes sense. There's a lot of research that shows that when you hire a lateral or a star hire and put them into an existing platform that is already strong, they tend to do better. And that makes a lot of sense. This is research by Heidi Gardner, for those who are interested in it. It also is research that was done by the Harvard Business School, not just in the legal industry, but also in the financial services world, that consistently shows that sort of the best way to hire laterally is to build on existing strengths. Expanding into new areas also, this same research shows, is extremely risky. It is an area where the success rates are low, the failure rates are high. Succession planning is sort of a mixed bag, interestingly. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But this is kind of just the business risk piece, right? There are other risks involved in lateral hiring that I think often get overlooked, which I think, Michael, you want to touch on some of that?
Sure. I mean, there are, and when you take a look at this slide, and you see in there that big. Thank you, Nick. That was a very nice addition there of the giant high risk stamp in red. Just making sure that we're making that point emphatically. That sure, there is always business risk, and yes, you need to really kind of nail that and get to ground on exactly what that business risk is, because as we said before, we know from the survey data, you're talking 60 to 65% of lateral hires that come without their promised book of business, without their full promised book of business. But you really have to focus on what lateral partners are going to be like once they've joined your firm. And we've got three categories here which really pretty much encompass everything else outside of business risk. We've got workplace risk, cultural risk, and reputational risk. And just going at those in reverse order, reputational risk is fairly obvious what it is in terms of the reputation of the firm. And you don't have to look much further than 1, 2, or 3 days of reading the legal press on any 3-day period to find a lateral hire that is moving into that problematic, damaging to reputational risk. I'm obviously not going to highlight any specific hire or specific story. Needless to say, just go back through your emails for the last 2 or 3 days, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And that's any 2 to 3 day period. There's obviously cultural risk, and as I said before, it doesn't mean that lawyers that don't fit with a particular firm, it doesn't mean that they're bad people. It doesn't even mean that they're bad lawyers. They could be fantastic people and great lawyers, but for one reason or another, they don't fit. And examples of that you find all of the time when you do deep dive due diligence is you will find people that are incredibly sharp lawyers, but they don't mentor younger lawyers well. You find people that are extraordinarily talented in terms of their black letter law understanding of their particular subject matter area, but they don't really have the communication skills that you would expect when it comes to interfacing with professional staff, which in a modern law firm is a really big deal. You will find people that have difficulty. They're perfectly nice. They're very talented, but they have real difficulty navigating compensation structures and reward systems that encourage a lot of teamwork, but effectively only reward personal production. And they really don't know how to navigate that successfully. And again, these are all things that larger modern law firms are requiring of their partners. Then, of course, you get to these workplace risk issues, which is, and we know this from speaking to many different types of stakeholders in the legal services sector, both in law firms and in in-house legal departments, that workplace risk is very significant. And these are people that are engaging in unwanted touching, or they have possibly some anger issues. They have issues that relate more to inherent personal conflicts. They have, frankly, leadership styles that don't mesh well with strong associate retention rates. There are lots of things that are involved with workplace risk that, again, you really need to have the full understanding of the kind of person that you're onboarding before you hire them, which is why that due diligence is so important and why those risks are very tangible and, as we all know, very, very expensive.
Yeah, I'll tell you, in the conversations we had with firms, I think most firms had a pretty good sense of the business risk piece. There was obviously challenges in finding, what the real book of business that would port over. There was challenges in the profitability. There was challenges to understand the individual's ability to develop new business. But those were sort of, they knew where they knew the sort of unknowns. I think on these other three, and this is part of the reason why we didn't even try to quantify these with circles or half circles, is the firms, I think, even struggle to get their head around this piece. And I think it is, to Michael's point, why we heard so many firms talking about sort of the latter part of the lateral hiring life cycle, which starts to get to that due diligence piece, the offer piece, the integration piece. This is where I found a lot of firms were really rethinking things and really starting to sort of try to engage with sort of how to alter their programs. I saw the common difficulties here that we heard consistently from firms was, one, gathering the right kind of information on candidates. Two, analyzing that information. I think a lot of firms felt like they were getting some information from credit reports or other reports, but they didn't quite know what to do with that. And three was sort of how to incorporate all of this stuff they get into the last parts, which is the integration and the structuring piece. That was a challenge for firms. Michael, do you have something to add there? Or sorry, Howard.
So it's Howard. Yeah. So I think while the LPQ is indeed the beginning of the entire kind of vetting process, and often contains a mountain of data and data points, I think there's still a lot of data to, as Michael says, to kind of gather, verify, and analyze. And we structure this data challenge in two halves. The first half is what we call open source intelligence. That's all the information that exists across numerous databases on a particular target candidate. And the second half is known as human intelligence, and this is information that can only be secured by talking with another person. So while the first half is indeed time intensive, it's usually straightforward. However, it's the second half that's hard. It's really, really hard, as this information is about relationships, clients, and this has to be viewed across and analyzed over several years worth of data. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is really sort of obviously highlighted in a data point that that Michael already alluded to, is sort of the book of business conversion. This is what I call sort of what percentage of the book shows up. And we asked firms to tell us, of the amount of dollars that you expected to show up, what percentage actually did show up in terms of a book of business. What we found is 38% of partners show up with what the firm expected. That means 62% of partners don't, right? So well over a majority. 32% sort of come in with 75 to 99%. 20% bring in about half to 75%, and 10% of partners bring in less than half. Now, what's interesting here is sort of the expected word. And Michael was the person who made me think about this after we sent out this survey. And I started to ask firms what they thought they meant by expected. What does expected mean to you? Is it what the partner promised, or was it the discounted amount? Because almost every firm told me, well, whatever the partner promises, we basically discount it almost. Sometimes firms would tell me 20%, sometimes firms would tell me 30%. Occasionally, I even heard a 50%. And I think that's a really interesting question here is are firms telling us that 38% came after the discounting? My intuition from talking to a lot of firms is that is what they're saying, that even after they discount, they're still finding that partners are not living up to even what are fairly modest expectations. And I think it does suggest that firms need to be doing more digging. On the LPQ piece, I think most LPQs at firms is the first line of defense. And we thought that we should focus on the LPQ because we did talk to a lot of firms about their LPQs. I have reviewed a ton of LPQs, so have Howard and Michael in their work. And we have found sort of consistently a few things in LPQs that a lot of firms are tightening up, but a lot of firms probably could still do some work. Howard wrote an article on this, so I think he might be best placed to sort of talk about this.
Thanks, Nick. And as Nick says, the LPQ is kind of difficult, but it is the beginning. It is the start point of the vetting process. But each and every LPQ is unique. Each law firm designs their own to reflect their own development and culture. There's no industry standard surrounding an LPQ, but basically it's laid out as follows: that the first section usually contains the basic information on a candidate. So number one, the biographical data. Two is usually the business and the financial data, and three, some aspects of their client. The next section contains a lot more detailed information on potential conflicts. 4 and 5, professional and personal references. However, and here's the kicker, it's the final section, which is often entitled Other Information, where questions regarding malpractice claims, lawsuits, outside interests, and other claims are going to appear. And it's this section that represents the greatest risk to a law firm, as most of the questions pertain not only to legal risk, but potential reputational and operational risk for the entire firm.
The other thing that we looked at was the kinds of checks that firms are doing. And one thing that really popped out at me here is one, initially, I think the first takeaway is there's a lot of checks here, right? There's bar and licensing reviews, client conflict checks, educational verifications. There's a lot of data coming in on partners. The next thing that occurred to me is sort of what we're looking at here on the graph is we asked firms to tell us, do they always do this check? Do they sometimes do this check? Do they rarely do this check? Or do they never do this check? To some degree, I don't blame firms when they tell me they never do something or they sometimes do it. I scratch my head when there is a sometimes. And I ask myself, why would you sometimes do something or rarely do something as opposed to never or always do it? And that, I have to say, I struggled with. I talked to firms about this and I interviewed them on this question. And what I heard consistently is sort of two things. Some of the global firms, I think, told me, and I think this is fair, they said, in some markets, we just can't do the same kind of checks we can do in the United States. And that makes all the sense in the world to me. What I would say there is I then followed up and said, okay, I get it. You can't get that data from that source. Are you then diving into other sources to get the same information? And that's where I heard some humming and hawing. And what I heard was firms, if they couldn't tick the box, they just sort of moved on. And so that's concerning to me that you know, when they can't do a criminal records check or an education verification check, they just then don't look in that area. The second thing I heard was firms telling me that in cases where the partner is sort of viewed as a friend of the firm, or they feel like they quote unquote know the partner, at times there's sort of people are given passes and they say, well, we don't need to do education verification check for that individual. I know that he or she went to X or Y law school. That is really concerning to me, because I think it suggests too much variation in the system. I think the other thing I consistently heard, and I think Howard can speak to this, is I think a lot of firms brought in all this data, but they didn't quite know what to do with it. They didn't know how to draw connections between them or what they were looking for. They know what the red flags are, right? When a criminal record check comes in and someone has a felony assault, well, then they know that that's a red flag. But they're not quite sure what are the gray flags that they should be sort of aware of. And that, I think, is a really important question for firms, and it's one I consistently heard them struggling with. Howard, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, as I kind of talked about earlier, kind of the intelligence really does come in two halves. The first is really open source, things like, as Nick says, the education verification, address verification, how many houses, boats, wives, husbands they may have, what types of donations they've made, what outside business interests they have, do they have any financial liens, what are they posting on social media, who are they following on social media. But the other half is really, does the market, what does the market really say about them when they're not in the room? Like, how do they react, when they're under stress and tight deadlines? How do they manage their third-year associates? how deep and robust are their client relationships. And so, we get all this information and we present, as Nick says, kind of an overall narrative, weaving in the open source intelligence with the human intelligence about the target candidate, so that the firm then has what we believe to be, anyway, all the necessary information to hopefully make an informed, better decision based on the facts.
Yeah, I mean, cutting to that human intelligence piece, the sort of last thing I noticed when we started to analyze this data is what's highlighted in red right now. The interviews piece. It shocked me that only a third of firms always do interviews with professional references. It shocked me that less than 20% of firms do interviews with previous clients or former colleagues. That seems like a real opportunity to get to know a person who you will call a partner. And I was surprised more firms weren't doing it. I think that's something Michael can talk to, is sort of, what these interviews look like, and provide a little bit of education as to kind of what are the options here.
Well, thanks, Nick. It is surprising that firms don't avail themselves of all the data and the intelligence that is available to them. Honestly, I think some of it is just the nature of the legal services industry tends to be very tradition bound, and it takes longer for our industry to adjust, so to speak, with all of the data and the intelligence that's available to them. And so there are, when you talk about enhanced referencing, about actually talking to the references themselves, about talking to clients, about talking to former colleagues, that there's a key recognition, I think, by this new generation of law firm leaders. I think there really is a keen recognition that when you bring a lateral partner into your firm, you are also bringing in a fair amount of risk. And as a result of that, you not only should you avail yourself of that intelligence about that individual, but honestly, you are entitled to it. The financial risk and financial costs are significant, but also when we talked about earlier about those workplace and the cultural issues, the impact on the firm of these individuals is really significant. And so you're going to want to look for those things that are not disclosed. You're going to want to look for non-disclosures, things that show up in your due diligence where there are things that really should have been disclosed, but they weren't. Things that on social media that may be alarming. Things that in their financial backgrounds that might be questionable. Things that bar disciplinary proceedings that for one reason or another may be sealed, legal troubles that were not disclosed. There are, and by the way, not to open up a whole other can of worms here, but all you need to do is talk to your friendly professional indemnity and legal malpractice insurer or broker, and they will be the first ones to tell you that the easiest way for a bad client to enter a law firm is through a lateral partner hire. It is the easiest way in for a bad client or a potentially difficult, very, very challenging conflict issue. And for that reason, firms, this new generation of law firm leaders, are really availing themselves of this data and of this intelligence. Well, how do you do it? Well, it has to be, it's all done compliant with the Fair Credit Reporting Act. It is all done with the knowledge and consent of the individual lateral partner. That's always the case. And I should say this type of deep dive due diligence is extraordinarily common in other industries. And it's been happening at these levels in other industries for decades. This is something that is arriving in legal services because, like I said, we tend to be a little bit more tradition bound. Everything that's done in sort of deep dive due diligence, the way it should be done, is it should be done in a way that protects both the firm and the individual lateral partner candidate. Things should be done on a double-blind basis, but there should be a recognition that you need to speak with former colleagues and clients and opposing counsel and market peers of these individuals. As Howard talked about earlier, you do need to tie in the open source data, the open source intelligence that you have. You have to look at that and compare it with the promised business and what the actual disclosures were on the LPQ. You need to pull all of those things together so you can figure out what have they not disclosed. Lawyers, I'm one of them, obviously, God bless us. We tend to make up our own rules when it comes to disclosure. And so for that reason, it's so important. It's so important to be doing these really intensive and intelligence-focused source interviews, so you've got a much better understanding of what it is you're bringing into the firm. And by the way, it's also massively helpful when it comes to onboarding. It's huge, and it's also huge on compensation. All of this intelligence is extraordinarily helpful in making sure that not only you're getting what you think you're getting in the recruitment, but also when they join your firm, they're busy, they have the business, they're a good firm citizen, they fit in really well, and things will go from there. And that level of intelligence goes a really long way.
I think that's a really important point on the sort of linking the diligence piece to the integration piece. I think, I heard some firms tell them that everything they heard or learned in the diligence portion, they incorporated into the sort of either the offer, right, which makes complete sense, or also into the integration. If they found out a partner had less than stellar business development skills, they knew they were going to partner them with a partner who maybe did have great skills so they could learn from them. If they learned that a particular relationship was maybe not as strong on the client side as they'd want it, they put a lot of emphasis in making sure that relationship could port, right? That was part of the integration plan, was, let's put a real focus on that one. I thought that was really wise. The other thing I'll say is on this source interview stuff, as someone who interviews people for a living, what I find consistently is you hear things in those conversations that sometimes surprise you. In almost every conversation I have, I hear something that I didn't know before. And I think on this particular side, right, digging into someone who the firm is going to call a partner, you will hear things. The people doing the interviews will hear things that will be extremely useful. And I know Michael and Howard sort of shared a few examples like this. Michael, Howard, do you guys want to talk a little bit about sort of these quotes?
Sure. I mean, I won't. Obviously, nobody wants to hear me read these quotes word for word, but I would say generally that when you are isolating the correct people to speak with, the right sources that are in a position to know, you really will get a holistic and accurate understanding of the individual themselves. And they don't have to say, they don't have to react necessarily in the way that these individuals did in terms of the quotes that you see on the screen. A lot of times, it's not necessarily what's said, but it's what's not said. A lot of times in source interviews, you'll find that long pause. You'll find that exhale of breath, that sigh. You'll find that uncomfortable silence followed by, hang on, let me close my door. These are the things that will happen that will give you an indication that maybe there are some challenges. And by the way, as much as there are red flags there's red flags certainly in about a third of the projects that we do. There's no question about that. But I'm not trying to make the argument that even in the cases of those red flags, that these people are bad and shouldn't be hired. Now, there are a fair amount where they really are problematic, and law firms really are dodging a bullet by doing proper due diligence at that level. But like I said before, a lot of it has to do with really understanding the individual, understanding their strengths, understanding their challenges, and really having a full understanding of what it is you're bringing, who you're bringing into the firm, just so that you can integrate them and help them out in their integration, in their transition, in their onboarding, so that they know what the firm's culture is in terms of how do we treat business professionals? How do we treat staff? What are our mentoring benchmarks in terms of our relationship between partners and younger associates? All of those things that can really, really help.
I think that's right. We're at the end of our time and also our webinar. I'm happy to answer any questions that have been sent in. I can certainly take a look at some of them. One individual says, so does the industry, in quotes, feel that 60% after 5 years is successful? In terms, and I think this cuts to our conversation earlier on retention rates. I think I think Michael and both I and Michael and Howard said, I think there's a lot that goes into success and failure rates. I think to the point on that how expensive these hires are, both from a dollar perspective as well as a time perspective, 60% retention after 5 years feels like not successful to me. Now, I will admit, I think there is some areas of gray here. I think that there could be hires that are, profitably accretive to the firm within 3 years. But I think the vast majority probably need 5 years to really start hitting their stride. And so 5 years to me feels like if someone were to stay 6 years, that to me feels like the beginning of success, or maybe the first 2 years of success. It doesn't feel to me like they've been successful for 6 years. That probably they took at least a year or 2 years to even begin being successful, much less paying back the dollars that were invested in them. That's my personal take on it. Howard, Michael, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It's Michael. If you talk to larger law firm CFOs, they will tell you that this level of quote-unquote success is not acceptable. It is too expensive. And what they will tell you, of course, is that there's no line item on a profit and loss statement for failed lateral. And so it's very easy when you look at the accountability and profitability of firms, which, as we know, is elevated and continues to go up and up and up. That's a whole different webinar, by the way. They will tell you that even though it's hidden in there in terms of those performance metrics, those success rates are simply not good enough because they cost the firm an enormous amount of money. And I understand the billable out the rates that law firms are charging and the amount of revenue we're talking about. But just to simplify things, imagine that you were a porcelain dealer, and imagine that every single that of all the pieces of porcelain you brought into your showroom, you took one of those pieces and you smashed them on the ground to bits. Most people would let you know that that's not a great inventory strategy, and that no business can sustain that level of breakage rate. And eventually this will catch up with the legal services industry, especially in private practice.
Another question that came in is, what do you view to be the biggest things that private law firms do wrong in lateral hiring? I can answer that question, but Michael, Howard, would you like to go first?
Go ahead, Nick.
Okay. I think how much time do we have? So I think one thing that certainly I think all law firms could be doing that that would at least begin to help the situation is take better account of the individuals coming into the firm, understand their own retention rates, understand their own failure rates. I think firms should be tracking their lateral hiring programs much more closely. To Michael's point, I would like to see line items. I would like firms to say, this is the amount of dollars we invested in this individual person. This is the dollars we spent in terms of the overhead we carried to bring them in. If it was a 6-month hiring process, put some dollar amount on how much bringing in a lateral hire costs. Put a dollar amount on the integration piece. Put a dollar amount on their salary for the first 2 years, and understand how profitable is this whole endeavor. I asked every single firm I spoke to how much data they track on laterals, and in many cases, to Michael's point about that awkward silence, that's what I heard. And I think that's a real mistake. So that's one. I think two, I think firms should be more strategic. I really do. I think I get the opportunistic piece. I understand it's hard to say no, but I do think firms should be really, really skeptical. I love the 2-tier system that Howard mentioned, because I think at least it says these resources, these individuals are going to be purely strategic. I think that's a fascinating idea. And then also, what we talked about, I think firms should be doing deep dive interviews, source interviews, and diligence on candidates. It makes all the sense in the world to me, particularly with the stuff we see in the news every day. The brand risks, the cultural risks, they're just too big to not do that stuff.
So Nick,
another question.
So Nick,
yeah.
Nick, I would add to that if there are any CFOs out there listening to this webinar who are actually tracking data at that level, congratulations, you are an industry leader and you deserve your own webinar.
Yeah, please contact me. I would love to learn how you're doing it, and also potentially talk to you. Maybe we could write an article for the American Lawyer, or maybe do a webinar. This is a question that I suspect Michael or Howard, you guys might be best placed to answer, or maybe none of us are. How do you deal with laterals that have a contractual obligation that they are not able to disclose their departure or contact with their client?
Well, it's an interesting question. It really does depend on the state. And I know that it's crazy that, you'll listen to what I'm saying and you're saying, great, well, you've got an answer that's a non-answer. But the answer is that it really does depend on the state bar and what their rules look like. But the one thing I would say that I think everybody should look at, and the questioner, the person who asked that question, raises an extraordinarily valuable point. But people should understand that when it comes to cultural issues, when it comes to those integration points, when it comes to those social issues, when it comes to all of those workplace risk issues, all of those things, law firms have every right to have a better understanding of the individuals they're bringing into the firm. And that really exists apart from these issues of who you can legally provide notice to and what the ethical rules are. Now, that said, I definitely do have other answers that go more to that specific ethics piece, but that would swallow an entire additional webinar.
With that was our last question. I'm also cognizant that we are now 6 minutes over time. I think we should let everyone get back to their days. You see our emails up there, mine, Howard, Michael's. Please reach out to us if you have any questions tomorrow you will get, or maybe later today, I'm not sure when they will send it out, you'll get the slides that we presented today. We will also send you a link to download the report that Decipher and ALM Intelligence together did. It's entitled Risky Business, and looks at all of the issues that we discussed today, as well as a whole host of other issues. If you liked the data you saw today, I would encourage you to go download that report. For those of you who are ALM Intelligence customers, you can log into ALM's Legal Compass tool and download it there. There are tons of ways for you to get the report, so please either email us or find it online or find it on Compass. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Obviously, Howard, Michael, thank you, and we will all talk later. Thank you. Bye-bye.